And now for a message from our sponsor, the Environmental Defense Fund. Please welcome Jason Mathers, Director of Vehicles and Freight Strategy at the Environmental Defense Fund. He's in conversation with Sam Stockdale, Vice President and Head of Environmental and Sustainability at Link Industrial Properties. Jason, over to you.
Thank you for joining us today. I'm Jason Mathers, Senior Director of Vehicle and Freight at Environmental Defense Fund. And today we're joined by Sam Stockdale, Vice President of Environment and Sustainability at Link Industrial Property. Sam, thank you for joining us today and for your leadership in supporting the deployment of zero-emission trucks. Could you maybe start by talking about how Link fits into the transportation landscape and what the company's role is?
Well, I would say one of Link's guiding principles is to leave our assets in communities better than we found them. But what's significant related to the transportation landscape is that we are at the nexus of the country's supply chain. And Link owns over 3,000 distribution industrial assets, facilitating logistics and e-commerce across the country, which puts us right at the pivot point between the real estate sector and the transportation sector, which together account for about 60% of US emissions. And so as a leading landlord and firm, we have a responsibility to operate sustainably. And to that end, we're pursuing many pathways to advance our carbon neutrality and renewable energy goals. And I believe that freight electrification is the future of the supply chain. And so that's an opportunity for us here at Link to use our immense scale to catalyze fleet electrification.
So thank you, Sam. Why has Link partnered with Environmental Defense Fund?
So I would say that most organizations would benefit from a partnership with EDF, but personally, I have a long-standing relationship with EDF over the last 5 or 6 years. And in fact, in my prior life at JP Morgan, we had EDF Climate Corps fellows come on every summer to support our 100% renewable energy goal. And I actually hired one here at Link, Ram Kama, who's one of our aces in the energy economics and data analytics space. But this time around, I've been reading one of your white papers, and I think it was either financing the transition for truck electrification, or it was the fleet electrification case study paper. And I think that same day, I had reached out to Yash, who was managing the Climate Corps program at that time, and said, you got to introduce me to the authors of these papers. And actually, I think that led me to you, Jason. And so, while I couldn't do any justice in explaining those studies, they were by far the deepest accounts of economics related to fleet electrification and other structural barriers to enablement that I've seen to date, or at least they're the best ones that I could make sense of. And so I think aligning with EDF, one of the leading environmental advocacy groups in the world, I see a best-in-class partner to help us think through a thoughtful business case for folding fleet electrification into Link's long-term business planning.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful working with Link, and Link is, a critical player in this ecosystem for developing charging and charging support structures for zero-emission trucks, electric trucks in particular. And I'm wondering if you could talk about some of the barriers that your customers are facing when they are considering electrification.
Absolutely. I would say that there are two main challenges or barriers that come to mind. The first would be initial cost and availability of fully electric vehicles. And early generations are going to be expensive. And many of the fully electric models, particularly those Series 7 and 8 trailers, they're still in prototype phase and won't be rolling off the line or commercially available at scale for a few more years, with the exception of a few 100,000 per year that are in production from the Rivians and the Teslas and the Nikolas, which are largely committed in the near term to large companies who aren't capital constrained. And the second is space for staging and charging. And the energy infrastructure development capital and expertise to build megawatt scale capacity charging stations for fleets will have to be grid connected, which adds a little bit of extra complexity when trying to scale fleet level charging facilities. And so while Link may not be able to solve the first by buying electric fleets for everyone, I think we can be solutions oriented around the second. And in fact, I would say a distribution warehouse could be an ideal place for fleet electrification and staging, both for operator-owned fleets and third-party fleets. And actually, that brings me to one last point I'd like to make, which is that the majority of our customers don't own their fleets. And while it's incredibly encouraging to see many of our Fortune 500 top-tier customers make fleet-related carbon reduction commitments, such as the FedExes and the UPSs and the DHLs and Walmarts, Home Depots, et cetera, this can be a hard to reach segment. And it's hard to reach because those mandates have to be picked up by freight partners. And so the other part of this is that the firms I just rattled off tend to be the exception and not the rule. And so not only do the majority of warehouse operators not own their fleets, but a lot of them are small businesses. And at Link, small businesses make up 80% of our customer base. And so our strategy is geared towards ensuring that an amenity exists for those who are first to market, and that we're also providing pathways for the smaller players to plug in when they're ready.
Great. Well, thank you, Sam. And I think it's really an important place for Link and for other warehouse and retail space providers to play in. And one of the policy barriers that we've seen is that a lot of charging infrastructure programs have some simplifying assumptions. And one of those is that the fleet that's purchasing the zero emission truck, the electric truck, owns the facility and is going to be in that facility for 7 to 10 years, and that's often not the case. And so it's really important to have third party providers like yourself in this space and playing an important role in making sure that infrastructure gets in the ground. So
Absolutely.
with that, I'm wondering, beyond the importance of the service to your customers, why is transportation electrification important to Link?
Oh gosh, I mean, so many things come to mind, I would say, but I guess really two particularly are jumping out at me that you just mentioned. And I think the first is coming back to my very first statement about leaving places better than we found them, is about improving community health. And I think you touched on an important note here in that emissions from idling diesel trucks and distribution centers can have an adverse effect on air quality. And that, combined with the fact that some of our assets are located in at-risk communities, means that there's a possible negative community health impact. And so while we can't choose fleet operators for our customers, we can absolutely facilitate their transition to lower emitting vehicles and therefore improve those communities where we're operating from an environmental perspective in the long term. And so the second is really transparency. And to me personally, sustainability means that we're building a replicable model that others can follow to magnify positive impact. And so our intention is to pave this path, to work with EDF specifically to author white papers about our successes and failures, and then to give away that playbook to anyone who wants to know how we did what we did so that they can either iterate or improve upon what we've done for greater uptake. And so we think that's the kind of leadership, and not keeping things for yourself, but asking others to join you is what leads to measurable change.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, it's I think a really dynamic time, and it's great to have folks like Link diving in here and developing best practices and being willing to share them so that we can all move further faster. The final question, Sam, is can you talk a bit about what are the short and long-term steps Link is taking to be a core partner in the transition to 100% zero emission vehicles?
Absolutely. In the short term, I would say that at Link right now, we're building a foundation of research and analysis and partnering with groups like EDF, right, to understand both the project and the energy economics associated with charging infrastructure. We're talking with manufacturers to understand different classification of vehicles, and we're listening, as you mentioned earlier about public policy, we're listening to those public policy groups to ensure that we've gathered as much intelligence as possible for us to build a cohesive solution for our customers. And I would say that the long-term steps are much more grand, right? So we've mentioned infrastructure a few times throughout this conversation, and we want to enable infrastructure charging and staging where practical, and also offsite from fleet charging and staging facilities across hubs on high density freight routes across the country. And so we really want to not just be a progressive partner in this space, but we want to be the tip of the spear and create that playbook and roadmap, as you mentioned.
Yeah. Thank you, Sam. And I think that's really as EDF thinks about our work in this space. We think about kind of two key areas where we're pushing. One is for driving near-term deployment of vehicles, and clearly Link has an important role there in the place you have in the charging ecosystem. And the other one is putting forward, securing the policies we need to accelerate this transition. And as I think about the work that Link is doing, one of the things that I see as a point of connection between these two is the important role that public policy has in enabling companies like Lyft to make the bold investments that are necessary, to develop the charging infrastructure and the supporting ecosystem that zero emission trucks need. With that, Sam, I'd just like to thank you for taking the time today to talk to us and for your investment of time continuing to drive help drive the future of zero emission trucks in the U.S.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.